So when looking at a potential student's posture, I think it's important to remember that there's no perfect posture. There's no right or wrong with this. There's no bad posture or good posture. You're looking at your students not so that you can tell them everything that's wrong about them. You're looking at your students' posture so that you can teach a class that's tailored directly for the greatest benefit of that student. That means you're actually tailoring your cues and the poses that you choose for that student's greatest benefit. And in order to know what those poses to choose and those cues to use are, you need to know your student's posture and habits. A lot of these things just come down to habitual patterns of movement. For example, a lot of sports end up being quite one-sided. If you can imagine baseball or cricket or golf or tennis, a lot of times it's twisting to the same side every time. Even here in Bali, there are a lot of surfers, right? But they almost always are with the same foot forward when surfing. So we create a lot of imbalances in the body, a lot of asymmetries. And yoga can help to undo that when you know these things about your students. So when you're looking at your student's posture, I think it makes the most sense to start looking at them face on and starting from the ground up, because what happens in the feet and the ankles is bound to be reflected in the knees and the hips. So you can use me as your example here. If you look at a student to find out what postural type they have, you would ask them to stand comfortably. Now that's really difficult to do actually when you know that you're being watched and analyzed by a potential yoga teacher, but just think about making them as comfortable as possible. Tell them to soften their knees, maybe shake it out a little bit first, and then you can look at them head on. And starting with the foundation, starting with the feet, a couple of things that you may notice. The first is that some people tend to stand with their feet a little bit more out, like this. They used to call this duck-footed, which is not a very kind phrase, I don't think. Usually what's happening with the feet, if they're turned outwards or inwards, probably actually comes from the hips, the rotation of the thigh and the hip joint. If you've got an external rotation of your thigh and your hip, that's probably going to turn your feet out. And if you have more internal rotation, that's probably going to turn your feet in. So if your student has any kind of pain or discomfort from this, they may not. They may be perfectly happy with this kind of a posture, and that's fine. But it may, over times when used repetitively, cause injuries later in life in the knees and the hips. So if they're experiencing pain, if this is something that they want to work on, just think about sequencing poses that do the opposite. So if they're finding, if they've got the toes turned inward, which again, when we used to compare humans to animals, was called being pigeon-toed, you could perhaps find poses with more external rotation of the hips. Things like your pigeon pose. Funny, pigeon pose undoes pigeon toes. You could find pigeon pose. You could find any of those poses like lizard, or like Baddha Konasana, Supta Baddha Konasana, that take the knees outward, externally rotating from the hip joint, and that will start to correct that inward rotation of the thighs if that's the cause of the feet being turned inward. And likewise, if the feet are turned outwards, perhaps internal rotation of the thighs is what's needed to strengthen those adductor muscles and the internal muscles. Things like Virasana pose is probably the best example I can think of internal rotation of the thighs. When the feet come out to the outer edges of the hips, the thighs are rolled inward and you maybe even start leaning back. That starts to build up the ability to internally rotate the thighs. Now, with that being said, their limitations may not be at all because of muscular tightness that stretching can help. It may just be the shape of their femur, their thigh bone, and the way that it fits into their hip bone. And I'll show you some pictures of different ways that femurs fit into hip sockets because there's a massive variety across different people. Everyone's different. Our anatomy is so unique and individual. So that's one thing to look for about the feet, if they're pointed out, pointed in, and if that relates to rotation of the thigh and the hip joint. The second thing you can look for is the arches of the feet, if they're collapsed, flat-footed, or if they're extra high. Now, a lot of times what happens if your student has a collapsed arch and the feet are sort of flat and rolled inward, you can see how even just trying to do that affects my knees. If I try to flatten my feet to show what flat feet look like, my knees start to turn inwards here. They used to call this being knock-kneed. Also, probably comorbid with internal rotation of the thighs. Just by applying Pada Bandha, you've learned about Pada Bandha, gripping the toes back into the mat, allows you to really work on those small muscles above the arch of the foot that draw the arch upward. Pada Bandha. Amazing how these ancient yogic energy locks actually affect our posture and had such a deep understanding of the anatomy of the body. Most students I've seen who have flat feet, once they engage Pada Bandha, you can watch that affect the knees. The knees start to turn outwards. The knees start to come back into alignment with the hips and the ankles, just by gripping the toes back towards them. Some other ways that your students with flat feet could increase their arches would be to keep the toes curled under, even anytime they're on all fours, for example. Rather than being flat-footed here, they could curl the toes under with that feeling of trying to pull the toes into the mat, like you're pulling your toes back towards you, and that'll keep on working those muscles of the arches to increase the arches. This is why when we're cueing as yoga teachers, you don't need to go around and fix those little minor issues like, are the feet flat? Are the toes curled under from all fours? Because there may be a very valid reason why your student is keeping their toes curled. They might know that they have flat feet and they're trying to increase their arches. These are the little tidbits that it's really cool to give to private clients that you might not give to the entire class. So again, flat feet, just drawing the toes in, lifts the arches, tends to help draw the knees back into alignment if the knees are collapsed inwards. Now the other thing that you might see is what's sometimes called being bow-legged, right? Where the knees go out more to the sides. Again, this often has to do with just the shape of the bones a lot of the time. As long as they're not also rolling onto the outer edge of the foot, I think a little bit of a bow in the femur and the thigh bone is perfectly normal. So just see what's happening at the hips, at the ankle, and if it's really just the shape of the thigh bone, but the feet are still gripping into the mat fine with nice arches, it's probably not something they need to work on too much. All right, traveling upwards then. So that was a bit of feet, a bit of knees. When you get to the hips, you may notice that some of your students are tipped to one side. This may be because one leg is just longer than the other. Again, those are normal differences in body types. It'll happen all the time. Or it may be that because of their habits and patterns, maybe they always stand with one hip cocked out to the side. Maybe they're always crossing one leg in the same direction every time they sit on a chair. Those are sorts of things that in their daily life they can start to build up different habits for, but that also you can be aware of when you're teaching yoga so that you don't exacerbate that habit. For example, if they're off to this side, maybe you're doing less triangle pose to that side and a couple of more to the opposite side to try to balance that, to stretch out the side that would be tighter. Again, if their hip is like this, that means these muscles are probably tighter. These muscles are being stretched all the time. So rather than increasing that same patterning by doing lots of triangle poses on this side, maybe you're actually balancing it out by doing more of that asana on the other side to stretch here and tighten here. you can actually build in an asymmetrical practice to bring balance into an asymmetrical body. As you travel up the spine, you're likely to notice that most, probably 90% of students, are a little bit tipped to one side in the shoulders. Usually the dominant side hands, if they're right-handed, that shoulder is usually the lower shoulder than the other. You might even notice this about yourself, that you tend to carry your handbag just on that one shoulder, for example. That's our habit, right? That's our stronger side. So we feel we can lift the handbag a little easier on that stronger side shoulder, but it ends up creating a little bit of a droop in the shoulders. That's totally normal. I don't think it's anything that yoga necessarily needs to fix. So that's looking at your student front on. If you were to look at them from behind, and if they were to lean forward a bit, you might be able to see that the shoulder dip could be caused by scoliosis. This is in rare cases where the spine actually curves to the side rather than just forward and back like a normal spine does, actually curves to the side. That would cause one shoulder to be lower than the other. It usually causes one concave and one convex side of the spine. Now, when it comes to scoliosis, there are a lot of different viewpoints about whether yoga is useful and in what ways yoga is the most useful. Lots of contradictory information about this, but I think the best advice that I've seen from yoga therapists is to instruct your students to be led by their own comfort. What that means is that they're finding an asymmetrical practice based on which side feels like it needs it the most. That means that in asymmetrical movements, for example, perhaps lateral stretching, if you raise one arm and reach to the side, and one side for someone with scoliosis feels much more difficult than the other side, do you think that they should do more repetitions to the difficult side or to the easy side? To the difficult side. A lot of times scoliosis is caused by tension in the back muscles that is actually pulling the spine out of alignment, out of center and off to one side. So if you can do more stretches to that side, spending a little bit more time there on the side that feels really tight, it can start to loosen it up, soften it up, so that you bring a bit more balance into the body. Now that applies even with poses that are asymmetrical with the legs. So even if you were in Warrior One pose, for example, you could have them raise just one arm, just the arm on the side that's tight, rather than both arms balancing, so that you're always working on stretching out that side that has the muscular tension that's pulling the spine into scoliosis, if it is. Okay, so that's a bit about scoliosis. Now the other thing that I would recommend, not just looking at your students from the front and the back, but also from the sides. From the side, viewing your student really tells you a lot of information about how to sequence a yoga class for them. Again, you can start at the foundations and look upward. You can imagine when you're looking at your student from the side, visualize a vertical line. Some osteos and physios actually hang a pendulum from their ceiling beams to create a straight line that they then have their clients stand beside. A straight vertical line, because what you're looking for is to see what's the alignment of ankle, knee, hip, shoulder, and ear. Ankle, knee, hip, shoulder, and ear. These may be perfectly aligned for some people. They may be completely out of alignment for others. They may be arched through the spine. They may be hips forward, leaning back. There's lots of different alignments that you'll see in your student's posture. The first one to look for there, if you imagine that vertical line, is to see, is your student forward weight bearing, like Michael Jackson's anti-gravity lean, or are they backward weight bearing? That means if that vertical line was aligned with my ankle, am I leaning forward in front of it in my natural stance, or am I leaning backwards behind it? Now let's explore what would happen if I was forward weight bearing. That means my weight is leaning forward in front of that vertical line. So if you see this forward weight bearing, starting from the bottom, looking at the ankles, what you'll first notice is that in order to keep myself from not falling forward right now, My calves are working extra hard. Got really tight calves right now, just trying to keep me from falling forward flat on my face. I'm really engaging the calf muscles to try not to fall forward, but at the same time, they're in a lengthened position. This is sometimes called locked long, when a really long, elongated, stretched muscle is extremely tight. That's the locked long position. That means there's tension there, even when it's at its longest, stretchiest form. So all that to say, your forward weight-bearing students will have really tight calves. They'll probably want to do things like ankle circles. The other thing that's comorbid with this forward weight-bearing is that chances are to keep yourself upright, your knees are going to be locked or hyperextended. Your students who bear their weight forward likely have hyperextended knees. The good news is that a quite simple fix for that is simply to micro-bend the knees and feel like your weight moves back towards your heels. It's impossible to be forward weight bearing if I have a micro bend in my knees. It automatically sets my weight backwards. Otherwise, it's pretty uncomfortable on your toes. So just by micro bending the knees, you can find a more even spine for those students who have locked knees. The next time you see a student who tends to really lock their knees out, just notice if they also bear their weight forward. So again, gentle bend in the knees can fix that. What normally happens if someone has this posture, first of all, our eyes are always trying to be level. Our eyes always want to seek a level horizon. So no matter what your spine is doing, even if you're really rounded in the back, you're not going to just stare straight at the ground. You're still going to be lifting your head to have a nice even horizon, a nice level horizon. Likewise, if you're forward weight bearing, because you're taking your weight forward, you're probably going to be lifting your chin a little more to keep your eye line level. For those students who do tend to bear their weight forward like this, again, in order to keep their eye line level with the horizon, chances are they're having to lift their chest and roll their shoulders back, which creates a sway in the lower back. This exaggerated lumbar curve is called lordosis, an exaggerated lordotic curve in the lumbar spine. Lordosis. So if your student has lumbar lordosis, they're likely to have tightness and pain in the lower back because these spinal erector muscles are engaging super hard all the time to try to keep the heart lifted, to try to keep the chest lifted. These students will probably love child's pose, anything that rounds the back the opposite way, more forward folds to help relieve that tension for them, working on stretching out those muscles of the lower back with forward folds. Now, the portions of our spine are related. Both our cervical spine, our neck, and our lumbar spine are curved in the same direction. Likewise, our thoracic spine, our upper back, and our sacral spine, our sacrum, or just leading into the tailbone area, they're both curved in the same direction as well. So lower back and neck are concave, and upper back and sacrum convex. That means that those portions of the spine that have the same curvature are really related. So if your lumbar spine is in a lordotic curve, if it has an exaggerated curve, chances are your cervical spine does as well. Whatever you do with your neck is likely to be repeated in your lower back. This is why even in back bends, if you insist on throwing your head back in a back bend, chances are it's going to dump the back bend into your lower back.
Okay, so scene change because my camera battery died, so now I'm at home and you might see my crazy cats running in and out of frame. They're fascinated by this map for some reason. So as I was saying, that with the neck, chances are that they're also craning the neck and creating tightness in the back of the neck because of course we always need our eye line to be level. And what happens in the neck happens in the lumbar. So if the neck is constantly craned up, there's probably tension in the lower back as well. Now there's a point in the neck called the dens point. This is between the top two vertebrae. It's this pivot point where the skull pivots on the neck. You can feel it as that hollow spot at the base of the skull. And when you press your ears back in line with your shoulders, that becomes less hollow. You actually press it out so that it's convex. That's the dens point. Just by drawing the ears back in line with the shoulders, it feels like you're making a double chin for yourself. That often helps us to align axially from the crown of the head. So rather than having a student try to just stand up straight or pull their shoulders back to get better posture, often just saying draw your ears back in line with your shoulders will allow you to align your posture from top to bottom. So the other thing to look at then is the tilt of the pelvis. You can imagine if your pelvic bowl were an actual bowl filled with water. You can see when you look at your student from the side if that bowl is tipping forward, water spilling out the front, or if that bowl is tipping backwards, water spilling out the back. By looking at their waistband, usually that should be considered pretty level rather than tipped forward or tipped back. Tipping forward is called anterior pelvic tilt, forward pelvic tilt. That leaning forward posture is usually seen with an anterior pelvic tilt as well, which usually leads to lordosis of the lumbar spine, tightness in the lower back muscles, and the neck being craned back. So if you think about a pelvis being tipped forward, which muscles do you think are tighter here? Do you think it's the hip flexors, or do you think it's the glutes and hamstrings? If one of those muscle groups is tight and pulling the hips forward, do you think that that's the hip flexors or the hamstrings and glutes? Chances are your students who have anterior pelvic tilt probably have tight hip flexors and lengthened or stretched glutes and hamstrings. Should that student do more forward folds to keep lengthening the hamstrings, or should they do more lunges, for example, to stretch the hip flexors? Probably more lunges. Anytime you do a one-sided lunge, you get really deep into those hip flexors, especially if you focus on drawing the tailbone under posterior pelvic tilt. You can really start to stretch the psoas and the hip flexors. That'll loosen up and help to contribute to not tipping the pelvis forward so much. The more stretched these are, the less it will be pulling the pelvis forward. Likewise, the stronger your glutes and your hamstrings are, the more they'll contribute to finding balance in the pelvis. Rather than these being super long and lengthened from doing so many forward folds, if you find strength in the glutes, that'll help bring the pelvis into balance. Luckily, a lot of our lunges do both things at the same time, right? Even a warrior one pose stretches the psoas on one side and strengthens the glutes and the hamstrings on the other side. Your students who have that anterior pelvic tilt probably have pain in the lower back from the erector muscles always engaging to keep them upright. They probably also have worse menstrual cramps for your female students because of the way that the organs are all sitting on top of the uterus. If the uterus is tucked under like this, it can cause a lot of discomfort. So just by correcting that anterior pelvic tilt, they'll probably find that a lot of their chronic pain is alleviated. So think about stretching hip flexors, strengthening glutes and hamstrings, and also encourage your students to really use their core, that sense of the deep core muscle, the transversus abdominis, which sits underneath the rectus abdominis abs, pulling the navel in, Uddiyana Bandha, that upward flying movement of drawing the belly in and up like you're zipping up. You can see how already if I try to have an anterior tilt and I pull the navel in, that already starts to align the hips. Mula Bandha, pelvic floor engagement, helps with this as well. Drawing in the pelvic floor, drawing in the navel. There's the crazy cats. That helps to align the pelvis. Now, the opposite may be true for some of your students as well. You may have students who bear their weight backwards past that midline, which is often seen with the opposite pelvic tilt, which would be a posterior pelvic tilt, like the tailbone is drawn under all the time. So if you see someone with a posterior pelvic tilt, the pelvis is tipped backwards. This is sometimes called a swayed back posture. Tipped backwards pelvis. Do you think that their quads and hip flexors are tight or lengthened? And are their glutes and hamstrings tight or lengthened? You can try this yourself. To get a posterior tilt, which muscles are engaging, tightening, and which ones are stretching? Yeah, chances are you're feeling your quads and your hip flexors lengthened and your glutes and your hamstrings engaging really tight here. So the opposite is true for these students. They should do more forward folds to really lengthen the glutes and the hamstrings. And they should do more hip flexor strengthening poses to tighten these up. Things like reverse crunches. So if you lay on your back and you lift and lower the legs, that's all hip flexors strengthening, tightening. That's really working those hip flexors to bring strength into them. So these students who have posterior pelvic tilt should do more forward folds and more hip flexor strengthening asanas. That posterior pelvic tilt usually comes with kyphosis in the thoracic spine. Thoracic kyphosis means that the upper back is extremely rounded forward, more than it should be. Of course, all of our thoracic spines are naturally rounded forward, but this is when that's really exaggerated. What you'll see with those students is that they often can't lift their arms alongside their ears because their whole spine is facing forward. They may only get this far. So to modify for a student like this, what you can do is add in extra heart openers. You may change the way that you enter things like forward folds, for example. Rather than coming into forward folds with the arms alongside the ears, if theirs will be like this, then better to change the hand position into something like a swan dive, where you can really press your heart forward, or maybe cactus arms, coming down with the chest really pressing open to try to flatten that thoracic curve. A lot of times teachers will teach prayer hands, but I think that exaggerates the thoracic kyphosis. So rather than prayer hands, have them open the heart with a swan dive. Really encouraging external rotation of the shoulders for them so they sweep the arms out wide rather than raising them in front where they might just get stuck here. So it's not just in the postures that you choose, but how you modify the postures for that student. Even in things like Warrior One, any poses where the arms are normally raised alongside the ears, you can have your students who have kyphosis simply come into cactus arms, and this will help to open the chest in those postures. For these students, things like upper back bends will be really useful. But again, remember that we don't want to be overstretching the hip flexors if their kyphosis is comorbid with a posterior pelvic tilt. So you want to be finding things that open the chest, but that don't keep the tailbone tucked under too much. Tricky. Some that I can think of would be like fish pose, for example, lying on your back. Because in fish, you're not actually stretching through the hip flexors here, they're still actually flexed. You're just lifting the heart, opening the heart. And that's exactly what we want to be trying to do for our kyphotic students, to get them to just open the heart without necessarily overstretching the hip flexors. Now, in the modern day, most of us are spending quite a lot of our times on computers or on our phone, and that tends to give that kyphotic upper back rounded forward head thrust. So I think it's important to, again, remember aligning through the dens, opening the heart, and at the same time trying to keep the navel drawing in so that you've got this nice firm core to protect you in asana. And this is something that you can bring to your students. If you see that a student has this posture, which is often called kyphosis of the thoracic spine, that forward rounded spine, do you think that something like shoulder stand is a useful pose for that person? Shoulder stand. No, chances are that that's just going to make that problem worse, because now you're putting the full weight of the body in shoulder stand onto that part that's already rounded forward, already with a forward head thrust, and now you're just adding the weight of the body onto it. It's not going to help that student improve that. With private clients, it's not just about their posture. They'll likely have old injuries to tell you about and those sorts of things that you can modify for, surgery, issues, chronic pain. Finding functional posture can often help with a lot of those things, but you also want to make sure that you're researching about their very specific issues. For example, if they have a particular hip replacement or knee replacement or some other kind of issues, you want to know what you're dealing with there and what the best recommendations are for asana for those problems. But you also want to ask them about their mindset so that you can be sequencing in a way that works with the energies that they're dealing with. So you'll ask them, of course, about their work, their habits, their hobbies, and just generally how they're feeling. What are their struggles? What are their joys in life? So that you can see if you should do more of a yin practice or a yang practice, what in Hatha Yoga is called Brahmana and Langana. Brahmana, the more active, fiery practice, or Langana, the more relaxed, chill, very slow, cooling practice. You can figure this out for your meditations as well. Should you lead them in meditations for more self-confidence if that's what they need, or for more self-love and self-care to slow things down? So it's more than just posture. It's also mindset, emotional state, energy. All right, I think that's all I have for you about posture and sequencing for private clients. I hope that you enjoy. I'll give you a list of questions to ask private clients as well as things to observe about them so that you can start implementing this in your own private lessons. Namaste. Jack says hello. Good boy.